When Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the fire, it inspired visions of a coming age of the deep sea. He knew the path would be arduous, but he had not fear, for he would devour the gods themselves. In this video, we're going to be talking about the foundations of the Church of the Deep, how it became a belief in which clerics forsook their duties to the flame to pursue. We know the idea and revelation of the deep came from Aldrich when he was granted visions of it. But it takes a lot more than just a vision to push a religion that seems to have affected so many. I'd wager the real driving force behind Aldrich and the Church of the Deep is none other than the ambitious Pontiff Sulyvahn. So, let's backtrack a little bit and learn about the Pontiff, his upbringing, where he's been, and what could connect him to the deep. The sorcery Snap Freeze reads, one of the spells left behind by the young sorcerer Sulyvahn before leaving the painted world. Sulyvahn was born and raised inside the painting, yet had little use for his frigid homeland, since he had not yet experienced loss. Being from the painted world is certainly interesting, but not of any specific consequence. He was born there, so we know his mother called the painting her home. But what of his father? Who could he be directly, or who could he be associated with? I think the answer to that could be someone who shares quite a bit in common with Sulyvahn. And that, oddly enough, is Gravelord Nito. Let me explain. While you could certainly associate Nito with bones and skeletons for obvious reasons, but I'd say outside of the obvious, he's also closely associated with eyes. The Gravelord Sword Dance miracle reads, miracle known only by the servants of the first dead, Gravelord Nito. Nito sleeps deep within the giant catacombs, quietly overseeing all death, waiting for his servants to usher in the Eye of Death. And the Eye of Death reads, lure phantoms from other worlds. The dreadful eyes of death spread disaster across neighboring worlds. Phantoms lured to the host world may end up as victims, allowing the eyes of death to multiply and leading to further proliferation of bane. These eyes are meant to lure others into death, disaster, and chaos across different lands and worlds. But what does that have to do with Sulyvahn and his connection to Aldrich and the deep? Well, the Pontiff had a very similar practice he bestowed upon his knights through his eye rings. The Pontiff's left and right eye ring reads, bewitched ring that Pontiff Sulyvahn bestowed upon his knights. Knights who peer into the black orb are lured into battles of death, transformed into frenzied beasts. No wonder the Pontiff only provides these rings to those dispatched to foreign lands. So, knights peering into these black-orbed eyes of the Pontiff are essentially doing the same thing as Nito's eyes of death, with the added benefit, or drawback, of turning them into wild beasts. Now, whether these eye-inspired beast or beasts are the same kind that ravaged Astora, mentioned in the Ring of the Evil Eye, is a completely separate rabbit hole for another time. But to think of that connection shared between Nito and Sulyvahn certainly can't be coincidence, especially considering we clearly see Aldrich wielding some form of the Gravelord sword or the Gravelord sword dance. Now, the idea of Nito being Sulyvahn's father is far from a certainty, but it is fun to entertain when we consider his mother in the painted world and the empty casket next to Nito that's widely assumed to be that of his mates, and the fact that Sulyvahn is derived from the Irish name Sulyvahn, which translates to little dark eye, which could be indicative of a little Nito. But father or not, it isn't crazy to assume that Sulyvahn was associated with Nito and or his teachings in some way. Perhaps he himself could have become one of the Gravelord's servants for a time and helped Nito collect the Eyes of Death, until such a time as he could replicate the magic itself. But we'll go more into the connections between Sulyvahn and Nito at a later point. I mostly wanted to point out the idea early on, as we're talking about the Pontiff being a driving factor behind the Church of the Deep, and that we also see Aldrich wielding the Gravelord's power. Furthermore, we see evidence of the Pontiff's involvement with Aldrich and the Deep by reading Pontiff Sulyvahn's very soul. Soul of Pontiff Sulyvahn. Pontiff Sulyvahn of Irithyll imprisoned a god of the old royalty in the abandoned cathedral to be fed to the Devourer. The Pontiff wanted Aldrich to devour Gwyndolin, and I believe I know why. The life hunt scythe miracle derived from Aldrich's soul reads, Aldrich dreamt as he slowly devoured the god of the dark moon. In his dream, he perceived the form of a young, pale girl in hiding. The young girl likely being Priscilla, as far as we know, she was the only one to possess the power of life hunt. This is what was important to the Pontiff, I believe. The gods feared the incredible power of life hunt. We learned that in Dark Souls 1. If Aldrich possessed the power as well, game mechanics of us having to kill him aside, in theory, he'd become probably one of the most powerful beings in the world. On top of already devouring gods, he knew held on to a power they feared most. Then we have the small doll, which much like the doll in Dark Souls 1, allows its wielder to cross over a plane they would otherwise be unable to cross. Likely a trick Sulyvahn picked up in the painted world. The small doll reads, in the legendary old city of Irithyll, situated in the Boreal Valley, the Pontiff Sulyvahn gave this doll to valued subjects, so that they might use it to cross the barrier when they return home. We find the doll on the corpse of one of the Archdeacons of the Deep. So if Pontiff gave this doll to an Archdeacon, then he was one of the Pontiff's loyal subjects. Not to mention, in Irithyll itself, we see two of the Pontiff's beasts guarding the corpse of another of the Deep's Archdeacons, who allow us to further serve Aldrich if we wish. We also have to consider the fact that the deacons began using sorceries instead of miracles, which was considered a sin of their faith, which was likely passed down from Sulyvahn, who was himself a talented sorcerer. It's also interesting that the deacons of the Deep's robes and Pontiff Sulyvahn's each have what I suppose is a tabard over their robes that are quite similar in design. Even the Pontiff's own knights wield weapons affected by the deep. The Pontiff Knight curved sword says, "Curved sword wielded by the Pontiff's knights, frigid spirits that linger in Irithyll. The large blade appears to be eaten away by insects, making it lightweight but also brittle. Now, what kind of insect could chew through a blade? Well, we know of one such insect that might just do the job. The miracle Gnaw reads, Dark miracle taught in the Cathedral of the Deep. Summons an insect swarm to feast on foes. These insects, which lurk in the deep, have tiny jaws lined with fangs to tear open the skin and burrow into the flesh in the blink of an eye, causing intense bleeding. Which could be further indication of the Pontiff's close association with the deep, especially considering that the Deacons of the Deep once guarded the world against the creatures that dwelled there, but we'll get more into that later. Now, we simply have to talk about what the word Pontiff means, and it means simply the Pope. There is no other religion that Sulyvahn even appears closely related to other than the Deep, especially one that he could be the Pope of. It's often believed that Aldrich is the head of or in charge of this religion, but I think not. Aldrich is referred to as the Saint of the Deep, the saint being recognized as someone who has an exceptional degree of holiness or the closeness to a god. Aldrich was the figurehead of the Church of the Deep, the Jesus of the Deep, if you will, and Sulyvahn was, well, the Pope. Now that I've hopefully made sense of all of that, we can look into how the Deep came about and what it is. Originally, the deacons and clerics, and Aldrich likely as well, of the Cathedral of the Deep were dedicated to the way of white. The Archdeacon holy garb reads, Holy garb worn by an Archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep, a sign of the way of white's highest rank. So, a pretty easy connection there. The deacons were in the cathedral to fight back the creatures of the deep and seal them away. It seems that within the cathedral was some sort of portal or gateway to and from the deep, and is why they were stationed there to guard it. As the Deep Ring states, in the cathedral slumber things most terrible, and as such, the deacons require a grand narrative to ensure they do not falter in their duty. A philosophy to ward away the madness beckoned by the grotesqueries at hand. So, it's likely the cathedral was intentionally built around this spot to contain an offensive against the deep, so that it could not threaten the flame. We can even see inside the cathedral how grotesque things are. But they could not fight forever. The deacon robes read, Robe worn by deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The deep red pigment denotes the blessing of fire. In time, those dedicated to sealing away the horrors of the deep succumbed to their very power. It seems that neither tending to the flame nor the faith could save them. It's likely the same fall to the horrors of the deep that inspired Aldrich to begin his process of devouring people for power, and eventually gods. We know that during this time, many bloody battles took place within the cathedral, between the deacons and the beasts of the deep, perhaps even the pontiff's knights as well, considering the deep insects that chewed through their steel. So much death, in fact, that there were those tasked with disposing of the dead. The grave warden robe reads, "Rotting, tattered hood, attire of grave wardens at the Cathedral of the Deep." Grave wardens were tasked with disposing of the ever-rising corpses that plagued the cathedral. Their clothes are utterly putrid, drenched in the blood and mucilage of their undertaking. But what is the deep? It's hard to say for sure, but I believe it's the place souls and humanity and everything in between went when people died. Because it has to go somewhere, right? The Great Deep Soul Sorcery reads, Archdeacon McConnell, a sorcerer himself, delighted in the cathedral's stagnating souls. For him, they represented the glorious bedrock of this world. The stagnating souls, likely from all the fallen deacons and beasts as the war within the cathedral raged on. These souls, departed from their owner's body, simply began to stagnate within the deep. And we of course know in the Dark Souls universe, souls are the key to power. And as these souls stagnated within the deep, they collected larger and larger numbers. Thus, from where the power of the deep draws its strength. The human dregs description says, dregs are the heaviest things within the human body and will sink to the lowest depths imaginable, where they become the shackles that bind this world. The dregs seem likely to be whatever was left of people's souls or humanity, and it slowly sank into what would be known as the deep. And as we know, it eventually became corrupted, and corrupted those who were tasked with guarding it. It's only when Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the flame he was dedicated to protect, that he witnessed the true potential and power of the depths he had been fighting against, and he witnessed the age of the deep waters, made from the viscous liquid sediment that remained from the souls of the lost. He shared his vision with Sulyvahn, who sought power above all else. Thus, the Church of the Deep was formed by those the world thought kept them safe from it. Their miracles became sorceries, reflecting the power of the deep and the dregs that stagnated there. Aldrich began to devour and devour, until he bloated himself so much that he turned into black sludge, and is in some ways a sort of dreg himself. Before long, however, he in all of his might was tossed upon the flame by those who still served the fire and wished to see its age flourish. But alas, the bells would toll once again, and Aldrich would not follow his duty to the flame, but continue his dreams of the deep and devour the god of the dark moon to gain the all-powerful life hunt ability. Guarded by Sulyvahn and his knights, they bide their time to find a way to usher in the age of the deep seas. When the cathedral succumbed to the very power it was meant to drive back, 3 archdeacons rose to power to help bring their newly found visions of the deep to fruition. The first archdeacon we'll talk about is Royce. The soul of the Deacons of the Deep reads, after Aldrich left for the Boreal Valley, Archdeacon Royce remained in the cathedral with the high priests to keep eternal watch over their master's coffin. Which is the extent of what we learn about Royce. When the time came, and Aldrich rose from his grave and headed to Anor Londo, Royce stood guard with a multitude of deacons to keep watch over Aldrich's coffin. Royce is likely also the valued subject that Pontiff Sulyvahn bestowed the small doll to return to Irithyll with. And panning over to Irithyll, we find Archdeacon McConnell in his death-like slumber, presiding over the Aldrich faithful, calling upon its servants to steadfastly defend their master inside of the ruined cathedral. The cleric candlestick reads, candlestick used as both sword and catalyst, used for worship by the Deacons of the Deep. The deacons, under the guidance of Archdeacon McConnell, became both clergymen and sorcerers. So MacDonald was responsible for the deacons becoming proficient in sorcery. This likely came after their fall to the deep, as doing so was considered a sin, and is probably why they've covered up a lot of statues of Velka in the cathedral. The Archdeacon Greatstaff reads, large staff bestowed upon archdeacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The Archdeacon MacDonald's trespass, the sin of channeling faith for sorcery, transformed what was once merely a symbol of ecclesiastic authority into a catalyst for sorceries. We know the power of the sorceries MacDonald learned were from the deep, as the sorceries are called Deep Soul, Great Deep Soul, and Great Soul Dregs. My guess as to why it was considered a sin would be, well, for one, they obviously fell to the deep and would forsake their duties. But also, miracles and Dark Souls are quite unlike sorceries. Miracles are the tales of the gods and require the faith in these tales to cast them. In a way, I suppose it's along the lines of quoting holy scriptures and conjuring them through faith as a weapon or shield. When the Archdeacon threw his faith in these tales aside to pursue a different power, in the eyes of his faith he sinned, as well as turned his symbol of that faith into a catalyst to commit said sin. Though I doubt MacDonald became a talented sorcerer on his own, it seems more likely that was under the tutelage of the already powerful sorcerer and ally, Pontiff Sulyvahn. MacDonald was able to spread the sorceries of the deep throughout the cathedral, at least until he eventually took up residence in Irithyll to head the Aldrich faithful and keep his Saint of the Deep undisturbed while they found a way to usher in the age of the deep waters. Though we find his body maybe alive, maybe dead, or perhaps somewhere in between, deep down below Irithyll in the water reserves, it is perhaps poetically fit for him, as in the cathedral he delighted in the stagnated souls that sank deep down to the lowest depths imaginable and became the shackles that bind this world. Finally, there is Archdeacon Klimt. The Saint Bident description reads, a silver bident decorated by a holy symbol, formerly wielded by Saint Klimt. He discarded this weapon that draws upon one's faith on the day that he put his own faith behind him. So, much like every other deacon and archdeacon within the Cathedral of the Deep, Klimt put his faith behind him and embraced the deep. But Klimt was slightly different. He was both a saint and an archdeacon. But where did his duties land him? The archdeacon's skirt reads, skirt worn by an archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep. Of the archdeacons of the Deep, one attended to Rosaria, Mother of Rebirth, whom he deemed a goddess. This is the most interesting revelation of any of the archdeacons, in my opinion. Serving at least at some point, Rosaria could have a lot of implications. I have a pretty fun idea about the identity of Klimt, and if you'll humor me to hear it, we'll get to talk about H.P. Lovecraft. My idea is that Saint Aldrich was formerly Saint Klimt, and let me explain how. In researching the etymology of the name Klimt, I discovered that it's derived from the old surname Clemens and Clement. The first recorded use of this name was in the mid-12th century, where a Knight Templar of Oxfordshire named William Clement was also known as the church builder. And considering the implications of what Aldrich did when he ruminated upon the fading fire and witnessed the deep, his visions manifested the Church of the Deep, which I found just a little interesting while entertaining this idea. Next, we'll think about what it means to serve Rosaria. We know she's the mother of rebirth, and thus anyone serving her can very easily become someone else. And to me, that is very much like the time is convoluted argument. Sure, you can use that to say a lot of different things could have happened, but relying on that you can't technically prove me wrong stance isn't enough for me. Which made me think about the name Aldrich, which is very similar to the word Eldritch, which means strange or unnatural, especially in a way that inspires fear. Now, Eldritch is obviously highly synonymous with the work of H.P. Lovecraft, which we know had a lot of inspiration on the world of Bloodborne. But we didn't really see a lot of that inspiration in the Souls games, at least until we entered the Cathedral of the Deep and learned about Aldrich and the Age of the Deep Seas. That seems quite heavily Eldritch and Lovecraft inspired. Rosaria's Fingers Covenant item reads, Sacred Seal of Archdeacon Klimt, who served Rosaria, Mother of Rebirth. Rosaria's fingers collect tongues in her name. Some do it to be reborn. Others do it to help comfort their voiceless goddess. What's interesting about this is that the design of the seal is Klimt's and not Rosaria's. What's more interesting is that the design looks fairly familiar to, and could easily have been inspired by, one of the representations of the elder sign in Lovecraftian mythos. In that mythos, this elder sign is used as a way to divert attacks from deep ones and is inscribed on all the sealed doors in the city of Urlier, which is where Cthulhu dreams. A passage from the Call of Cthulhu says, "The nightmare corpse city of Urlier was built in measureless eons behind history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars." This could be similar to the way that the soul dregs in Dark Souls sink down to the unimaginable depths and make up the bedrock of this world, and that the deacons are beckoning in the age of the deep by trying to awaken some ancient old one that dwells there. The man-grubs we see outside of Rosaria's chambers are likely the close followers of Klimt, even from before he began to serve the Mother of Rebirth, as we can see them casting projectiles that represent the Saint Bident that Klimt wielded. When Klimt or Aldrich was granted visions of the deep is when everything changed, and could be a reason why he wanted to change himself, to perhaps fit the mold of a person he'd envisioned bringing in the deep. And with Rosaria so readily available, it'd be all too easy to do so. Then there is the conflicting arguments about Rosaria's firstborn taking her tongue from her. Does it mean literal firstborn? Or is it referencing the first person to become reborn by her? Say that it was the latter, and it was Aldrich as the first. Then, taking her tongue wouldn't be something that was out of character for a man who literally eats other men. And perhaps, if so, he did it so that she wouldn't give his old identity away. Or maybe it was just his first taste of flesh, and what gave him the appetite for it, and bestowed his lust for the joy of luxuriating in his victim's screams. I obviously don't know for sure, but that isn't too consequential to this theory at all. But if we're going to bring up Rosaria, then we have to bring up the ideas of who ripped that poor girl's tongue out. The idea of Aldrich using rebirth to become what he is now is also interesting given the symbolism of how he appears before us in-game, and how the man-grubs who have rebirthed too many times appear. They're almost identical, in shape at least. Elongated grub-like bodies that stretch across the ground and come upwards to a humanoid-like body, with 2 arms and a head. Sure, Aldrich became that way by eating too many men, but the grubs became that way by rebirthing too many times. So perhaps it's a transformation brought on by indulging yourself in your vices too often. But I think the symbolism between the two is still there. I want to leave this theory with reading a bit of a longer passage from the Call of Cthulhu, and if it doesn't sound like what could have been inspiration for the deep and Aldrich lore, then you're free to disagree with me. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around tall idols, which the Great One showed them. Idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule over Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something happened. The great stone city of Erlier, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. The only other theory I had for Klimt, which was far more boring than all this Lovecraftian stuff, is that he is the much larger man-grub on the bed with Rosaria. And my only proof for that is that there are only 3 types of deacons we see: small boys, tall boys, and fat boys. Royce was small, MacDonald was fat, so maybe Klimt was probably tall, and is why this man-grub is bigger than the others. I'm not sure, but I do tend to like the Cthulhu stuff better. I am finito. We weave death and watch over the dead. This task was granted to me by the one who gave us the first death. How long have Pontiff Sulyvahn and Aldrich, the Saint of the Deep, been up to their scheming and conquest? It's hard to say for sure, but quite a while is probably a safe bet. But these two are certainly a match made in bad guy heaven. We know what they're doing now, occupying Anor Londo and devouring the god of the dark moon. But where were they before? How did they meet? How did they rise to the positions they find themselves in now? I think I have an idea, or a wild speculation, which I suppose are one and the same in Dark Souls. Gravelord Nido once led a covenant of disaster, the Gravelords. Using the eyes of death, the Gravelords would lure their phantoms into neighboring worlds in order to spread disaster and destruction across those worlds. But the phantoms lured could end in defeat, allowing the eyes of death to multiply and leading to further proliferation of bane. In Dark Souls 2, we learn of the Grave Wardens. While not exactly the same as the Gravelords, they have their similarities. The Grave Wardens weaved death and watched over the dead, a task that was granted to them by the one who gave the first death, which is certainly an interesting phrasing. We know that Nito was the first of the dead, but there's been a long debate about whether or not that's a translation error, and it's meant to describe Nito as the one who gave the first death. Or maybe it's not, and he is the first of the dead given to death by the one who appointed the Grave Wardens. The point being that whether it's two separate individuals or not, their relation to death and crypts and skeletons and whatever are basically the same. They preside over death and the dead. Now, there was a group who plotted against the gods and at one point attempted to steal the power of Gravelord Nito, as referenced in Dark Souls 1 and in Dark Souls 2. There's a reference of a group who attempted to conquer the undead crypt. Now, were those two separate groups, two separate incidents, perhaps one inspired by the other? It's hard to say, but I do think that Aldrich was a part of one of these groups, and Sulyvahn was on the opposing side. We of course know that Sulyvahn was born in the painted world long ago, but eventually left because he hadn't experienced loss and had ambitions in the outside world. He sought a purpose that was bigger than himself, and I believe he found himself within the ranks of the Grave Wardens, defending the dead and learning everything about death itself. Hell, the Pontiff's armor isn't completely dissimilar to the Grave Warden's set, just more flashy. And we know that Aldrich was once a regular old cleric, until he began devouring human flesh and grew too ambitious. And perhaps in doing so, found himself storming tombs and trying to overthrow the gods. Because let us not forget that when consuming men was not enough for him, he began to devour the gods instead. Maybe in the tombs, he did find the power of the Grave Lord he sought. Or more likely, Sulyvahn taught him. In many ways, Sulyvahn and Aldrich were just as ambitious as the other. Sulyvahn wouldn't settle for forever remaining on watch over a crypt. But because Grave Wardens and Grave Lord principles and leaders aren't all that off from one another, Sulyvahn learned the way of both. But most importantly, the importance of the eyes of death. Consider again what it is that these eyes do. They lure phantoms into neighboring worlds to spread disaster. And then consider Sulyvahn's army of outrider knights, who were said to be given by the Pontiff these black orbs and were lured into battles of death, and then transformed into frenzied beasts. Those two things sound identical, aside from the Pontiff's eyes transforming the knights into mindless beasts. The Pontiff studied the eyes of death and applied them to grow his own army. And perhaps that isn't all the secrets he learned from the Gravelord, as we clearly see Aldrich using the Gravelord's sword dance miracle in our fight with him. More than likely a gift from Sulyvahn, just as the god of the Dark Moon was. Pontiff Sulyvahn used his eyes to spread disaster in as many places as he could, until nothing stood in he and Aldrich's way. Consider as well the Ring of the Evil Eye, which speaks of the spirit of a beast that ravaged and nearly destroyed Astora. I believe this to be some of Sulyvahn's early work with Aldrich, and Aldrich the Beast. A spirit or phantom of a beast was dispatched to Astora, as described by a ring that references eyes. Eyes of which we now know the Pontiff learned to manipulate and make his own. The eyes luring spirits to worlds, and his new eyes that turned them into beasts. So Aldrich peered into the Pontiff's eyes. He transformed into a beast, and his spirit nearly destroyed all of Astora. this is the change in Aldrich that made him begin to consume human flesh, so much of it that he would eventually bloat into sludge. Or it's the reason he became disillusioned with his ambitions and decided that man was not enough to devour, that he needed to devour the gods themselves. And maybe Aldrich's destruction of Astora is the very same reason that Henri of Astora hunts him down with such ferocity. Henri is even the one who gives you the ring, which seems pretty symbolic to why they hunt who they hunt. The ring of the evil eye even grants you health upon killing an enemy, not unlike Aldrich devouring his fallen foes, as you're essentially consuming their essence for your own personal growth or needs. You just don't eventually turn into sludge. Then of course we know most of Pontiff Sulyvahn and Aldrich's story from there on. A giant sludge man being sacrificed to the flame, but then coming back only to abandon his posts and get back to doing scheming things with his buddy the Pontiff. Sulyvahn continuing his journey of power and conquest, discovering the profaned flame and taking over Anor Londo and imprisoning Gwyndolin for Aldrich to soon eat. But it is interesting to consider the ideas of where all these Dark Souls characters were before we finally see where they're at. That is, of course, what all the lore is there to explore for.